The clip I wasn't supposed to see. I wasn't even looking for anything unusual when I found the clip, and that's probably why it unsettled me as much as it did. It appeared in a folder that shouldn't have been there, labeled with a timestamp that didn't match anything in my usual logs. I remember hovering over it for a second, thinking it was just some glitch, before clicking it open. The video started already in progress. No lead-in, no context. Just a fixed shot of my hallway at night. The lights were off, but there was enough dim ambient glow from outside to make out the shapes. Everything looked normal at first, exactly how I left it, except for one thing. There was someone standing near the end of the hallway. They weren't moving, weren't shifting their weight, weren't doing anything at all. Just standing there, facing directly toward the camera. I remember leaning closer to the screen, trying to make sense of it, expecting them to move or react. But they didn't. The stillness felt wrong, like the frame itself had frozen. Except everything else in the shot was perfectly normal. I couldn't see a face. Not clearly. Just the outline of a head angled slightly downward. What bothered me more than anything was how familiar it all looked. That was my hallway, my walls, my floor, everything exactly where it should have been. And yet there was someone standing inside it like they belonged there. I checked the timestamp again, then the system log. But before I could dig any deeper, the clip disappeared. Not corrupted, not hidden, just gone, as if it had never existed. I sat there for a while, staring at the empty folder, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it, but I knew I hadn't. Permita had seen it. And what stayed with me wasn't just the figure. It was the feeling that it had been there long before I ever opened that file. And the worst part was, I wasn't even sure how long it had been standing there. The thought settled slowly in my chest, heavy and hard to ignore, like something I should have noticed sooner. I kept replaying that single frame in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I had never clicked it at all, or if it had been meant for someone else. Why I installed the cameras. I didn't always have cameras in the house. For most of the time I'd lived there, it never even crossed my mind. It was a quiet area, the kind of place where nothing really happened, or at least that's what I used to believe. People kept to themselves, doors stayed unlocked longer than they probably should have, and nights were just quiet. Quiet. That changed a few months before I installed the system. It started with small things. A break-in 2 streets over, then another one not far from that. Nothing violent, just houses being entered late at night while the owners were asleep. Drawers opened, things moved around, a few items taken, sometimes nothing at all. It was the kind of thing people talked about briefly and then tried to forget, but it didn't really go away. One evening, my neighbor mentioned hearing footsteps outside his place well past midnight. Not walking by, but lingering. Didn't sound like someone passing through. It sounded like someone deciding where to go next. He laughed it off when he told me, but I remember the way he paused before saying it, like he wasn't entirely sure he should have brought it up. That stuck with me longer than I expected. After that, I started noticing things I hadn't paid attention to before. The way the street felt quieter than usual at night. How sometimes I'd wake up for no reason, just lying there, listening, convinced I'd heard something that didn't quite register. I couldn't point to anything specific, but the feeling was there, growing slowly, quietly. Installing the cameras felt like a practical decision. Something simple, something that would put my mind at ease. I wasn't expecting anything dramatic. I just wanted to know that if something did happen, I'd at least have some kind of record of it. The setup itself was straightforward. I placed one camera, facing the front door, covering the entryway and part of the driveway. Another went in the backyard, angled toward the fence and the side of the house. The third one I installed inside, in the hallway, positioned high enough to capture the main path between the rooms. Once everything was up and running, it actually worked the way I hoped it would. The feeds were clear, the motion alerts were reliable, and for a while, it gave me a strange kind of comfort. I'd check the footage occasionally, mostly out of habit, and everything always looked exactly the way it should. Normal. Still. Empty, if anything. It made me feel a little foolish for worrying in the first place. There were parts of the house I didn't feel the need to cover. It didn't seem necessary at the time. One area in particular, a small section just out of view from the hallway, felt too insignificant to bother with. I told myself it was fine, that nothing important happened there anyway. Looking back, that's the part I think about the most now. The first small glitch, it didn't happen right away. For a while, everything stayed exactly the way it was supposed to. The cameras recorded, the system stored everything neatly, and whenever I checked, the footage matched my memory perfectly. That was the whole point of it. It gave me something solid to rely on, something that didn't depend on how I felt or what I thought I heard in the middle of the night. The first time something felt off, it was so small I almost didn't notice it. I was going through the hallway footage one evening. Not because anything had triggered it, just out of habit more than anything else. The clip itself was uneventful. The hallway was empty, the lighting, the same dim glow from outside. Everything quiet and still. I was about to close it when I paused for a second. The door at the end of the hall was slightly open. Not wide, not enough to immediately stand out, just enough that the line of the frame didn't sit the way it normally did. It took me a moment to even register why it felt wrong. I leaned in a little closer, replayed the clip from the beginning, watching it more carefully this time. The door didn't move. It was already like that from the start of the recording. I frowned, trying to remember when I'd last been in that room. I was almost certain I had closed it earlier that day. Not just casually, but completely. It was something I tended to do without thinking, especially after installing the cameras. Close doors, check locks, small routines that gave me a sense of control. Still, it wasn't impossible that I'd left it slightly open. That kind of thing happens more than people realize. Memory fills in the gaps, smooths things out. I told myself it was probably that, just a small mistake I didn't remember making. I moved on. But later that night, I found something else. Another clip. Different time. Same hallway. This time it was a few hours earlier. I almost skipped past it, but something about it caught my attention. I slowed it down, watching more carefully. And there it was again. The same door slightly open, except in this clip, I was there. I watched myself walk down the hallway, pause briefly, and then continue past the door without touching it. I didn't even look at it. I just walked by like everything was normal. The angle made it clear. The door had already been open when I passed it. That didn't make sense. I sat there for a while, replaying both clips back to back, trying to piece together a version of events that felt logical. Maybe I had opened it earlier and just forgot. Maybe I'd seen it and didn't think it mattered at the time. There was always an explanation. There had to be. Even so, something about it stayed with me. Not enough to scare me. Not yet, but enough to make me hesitate the next time I checked the footage. Enough to make me look a little closer than before, like I was waiting for something else to be just slightly out of place. Movements that don't match memory after that. I stopped checking the footage casually. It became something more deliberate, something I set time aside for, like I was trying to prove a point to myself. At first, I told myself I was just being careful, making sure everything lined up the way it should. But the more I watched, the harder it became to ignore the small things. It wasn't just the door anymore. There were objects that didn't sit the way I remembered leaving them. Nothing obvious, nothing that would stand out to anyone else, but enough for me to notice. A chair slightly angled differently. A drawer, not fully closed. Once, I saw a glass on the kitchen counter that I could have sworn I'd already put away. I went back through the footage, trying to catch the moment it changed, but there was nothing clear. It was just different. I kept telling myself it was normal. People misremember things all the time. It's easy to overlook small actions, especially routine ones. But the more examples I found, the less convincing that explanation felt. Then, it started happening with the lights. I noticed it late one night, while scrolling through the recordings. The hallway camera showed the light turning on, bright enough to wash out part of the frame. I watched it again, expecting to see myself step into view, but no one came. The light stayed on for a few seconds, then clicked off again, leaving the hallway exactly as it had been before. I checked the timestamp. It was well past the time I usually went to bed. At first, I thought maybe I'd woken up and just didn't remember. That happens sometimes, especially when you half asleep. But when I checked the rest of the footage from that night, I didn't appear anywhere. No movement, no sign of me leaving my room, nothing to suggest I'd even been awake. That was the first time I felt something shift. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was more like uncertainty settling in, a quiet doubt that started to spread into everything else. I began questioning things I hadn't thought twice about before. Small gaps in my memory that I would have ignored suddenly felt important. So I started watching more. Hours at a time. I'd sit there late into the night, going through recordings, looking for anything that repeated. Any pattern. Any moment where something changed in a way I could understand. Sometimes I'd think I found one, only to realize it didn't quite hold up. Other times, I'd noticed something new, something that didn't fit with anything else I'd seen. The footage felt consistent, reliable. That was the problem, because the more I trusted it, the less I trusted myself. The frame that freezes too long by that point. Going through the footage had become routine, but it wasn't the same kind of routine as before. It felt slower, more focused. I wasn't just watching anymore, I was studying it, moving frame by frame when something caught my attention, trying to catch details I might have missed. That's how I found it. It was late, or at least it felt late. The kind of quiet, where every small sound in the house seems louder than it should be. I was scrubbing through a stretch of hallway footage. Nothing unusual at first. Just the same empty frame repeating itself. Then, for a brief moment, the video stuttered. Not a full freeze, just a hesitation. I almost skipped past it. The system wasn't perfect, and small glitches happen from time to time. But something about that pause felt different, like it held just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I dragged the timeline back and played it again, slower this time. The frame lingered. It was subtle, but it was there, a still image that didn't move when everything else should have. I leaned closer, narrowing my focus to the background, to the parts of the frame I usually ignored. That's when I noticed it. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. It was faint, almost blending into the darkness. Just a shape where there shouldn't have been one. Not defined enough to be clear, but not random either. It had a presence to it, something that felt separate from the rest of the image. I paused the clip and zoomed in. The quality broke down as I enlarged it, the pixels stretching just enough to make everything harder to read. Still, the shape remained. It didn't sharpen into anything recognizable, didn't resolve into something I could name, but it stayed consistent, like it belonged there. I sat back, trying to make sense of it. It could have been anything. A shadow, maybe, or some trick of the lighting that only appeared at that exact moment. Cameras pick up things differently than the eye does. They distort, exaggerate, create shapes where none exist. That's what I told myself. But the longer I looked at it, the harder it became to It wasn't just the way it appeared, it was where it appeared. Positioned just far enough into the frame to feel intentional, like it had been there the entire time. Just outside the range of what I normally paid attention to. I replayed the clip again, watching the moment it froze, waiting to see if the shape would shift or disappear. It didn't. Eventually, I closed the footage. But the image stayed with me, not clearly, not in detail, just enough to linger at the edge of my thoughts. That night, when I tried to sleep, I found myself picturing that frame over and over, wondering what I would have seen if it had lasted just a second longer. The camera that shouldn't exist, I didn't notice it right away. It was buried between other clips. Nothing about it standing out until I paused on the thumbnail for a second too long. The angle looked wrong. Not just unfamiliar, but off in a way I couldn't immediately explain. I clicked it open without thinking, expecting another hallway clip, maybe a glitch like before. Instead, the screen showed a part of my house I recognized instantly, but from a perspective I had never seen before. It was low to the ground, almost hidden, like it had been placed somewhere. It wasn't meant to be noticed. The frame captured the edge of the living room and the start of the small section just beyond the hallway, the same spot I had decided not to cover when I installed the system. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, something that didn't fully register as fear yet. I just stared at the image, trying to understand how it could exist. I hadn't put a camera there. I was certain of that. The clip itself was short, barely more than a few seconds, and for most of it nothing happened. The room sat in silence, dimly lit by the same faint glow I had seen in the other recordings. Everything looked normal, unchanged, exactly as I would expect it to be. Then, something shifted. It wasn't clear, not something I could point to directly, just a movement at the very edge of the frame, a slight change in the darkness, like something passing just outside of view. It didn't enter the shot, didn't reveal itself, but it was enough to make me stop breathing for a second. I replayed it immediately, slower this time, watching that same corner again and again. The movement was still there, just as faint, just as easy to miss. If I hadn't been looking directly at it, I probably would have ignored it completely. But now I couldn't unsee it. I backed out of the clip and went straight to the system settings, scrolling through every device connected, every listed camera, front door, backyard, hallway. That was it. Nothing else. No extra feed. No unknown device. Nothing that could explain what I had just watched. I checked the logs next, looking for any sign that something had been added or accessed. There was nothing unusual there either. Everything looked clean, exactly how it always did. When I went back to find the clip again, it took longer than it should have. It wasn't where I expected it to be, like it had shifted position within the system. For a moment, I thought it was gone, just like the first one. But it was still there, tucked deeper than before, almost hidden among the other files. I opened it one more time, watching carefully, waiting for that same movement to happen again. This time, it felt different. Not because it changed, but because I knew it was there. And that was when the feeling finally shifted into something heavier, something harder to ignore. It wasn't just confusion anymore, or doubt about my own memory. It was the realization that something existed inside that system that I didn't understand. Something that could show me parts of my own house from places I had never allowed. And whatever had moved just outside the frame hadn't felt like an accident at all. It felt deliberate, like it knew exactly where the camera was and how far it could go without being fully seen. That thought stayed with me long after. Reviewing footage at night, after finding that clip, I couldn't stop. What started as occasional checking turned into something else entirely. I began structuring my nights around it, waiting for the house to settle into silence before sitting down in front of the screens again. It felt easier to notice things when everything else was quiet, when there were no distractions, no outside noise to explain anything away. At least, that's what I told myself. The truth was, the silence started to feel different. It wasn't the kind of quiet I was used to anymore. It felt heavier, like it was pressing in from all sides, filling the spaces between every small sound. The hum of electricity in the walls, the faint creak of the house settling. Even my own breathing started to stand out more than they should have. I found myself pausing the footage just to listen. Not for anything specific, just to make sure there wasn't something I was missing. That's when I started noticing the gaps. They weren't obvious at first, just small inconsistencies in the timeline. Moments where the footage didn't flow as smoothly as it should have. A second error, maybe 2 seconds there. Easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention. But I was paying attention now. I began marking them mentally, going back and forth between clips, trying to see if they lined up with anything else I'd already noticed. Sometimes they didn't mean anything. Other times, they happened at the exact moments I would have expected something to appear. That's what made it worse. The cameras didn't just miss things randomly. The interruptions felt selective, like they were happening at specific points, cutting out just enough to remove something without leaving a clear gap behind. I tested it a few times. I would watch a section of footage normally, then replay it immediately after, slower, more focused. In certain clips, the timing would feel slightly off the second time around. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to make me question what I had just seen, or what I thought I had seen. There were moments where the screen would flicker so subtly, I almost doubted it happened. Other times, the playback would hesitate for just long enough to break the rhythm, then continue like nothing had changed. And every time it happened, it felt like I was getting closer to something. Not understanding it, not seeing it clearly, just getting close enough to feel that something was there, just outside of what the camera allowed me to catch. That thought stayed with me longer than anything else, because the more I watched, the more it started to feel like the system wasn't failing. It was choosing what to show, and more importantly, what to hide. The night I stayed awake, I stopped trusting the recordings after that. Not completely, but enough that I needed to see things as they happened. I told myself that whatever I'd been noticing, whatever didn't make sense, it had to be clearer in real time. No gaps, no missing seconds, no frames that froze too long. Just a continuous feed I could watch without interruption. So I decided to stay awake. I set everything up just before midnight. All 3 camera feeds open on my screen. The house was quiet in that familiar way. The kind of silence that usually felt comfortable but now seemed to complete, like it was covering something instead of just existing on its own. I sat there, watching, waiting for something to happen. For the first few hours, nothing did. The front door feed stayed empty, the driveway still and dark. The backyard camera showed nothing but the faint outline of the fence and the occasional movement of leaves shifting in the wind. The hallway remained unchanged. The same dim lighting, the same closed doors, everything exactly as I expected it to be. I almost started to relax. At some point I leaned back in my chair, eyes drifting between the screens, telling myself that maybe this was all it was. Just small inconsistencies I'd blown out of proportion. Maybe watching it live like this would finally put that feeling to rest. Then something moved. It was subtle, easy to miss if I hadn't been looking directly at it. The hallway feed flickered slightly. Not enough to call it a glitch, just enough to catch my attention. And then, at the very edge of the frame, something shifted. Not inside the hallway, but just beyond it. I leaned forward instantly, focusing on that corner where the view cut off. For a second, nothing else happened. Then it came back. The same kind of movement I'd seen before, just a slight change in the darkness, like something passing into the area the camera couldn't fully capture. I didn't think. I just got up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor as I moved, the sound breaking through the silence in a way that felt almost wrong. I made my way down the hallway quickly, every step louder than it should have been, my attention fixed on the exact spot I had just been watching. When I reached it, there was nothing there. The hallway looked exactly the same as it had on the screen. The doors were closed, the light was off, the air still. I stood there for a moment, listening, expecting something to shift or move or react to my presence, but it didn't. I checked the nearby rooms, one by one, opening doors, scanning corners, looking for anything that might explain what I'd seen. Everything was exactly where it should have been. undisturbed, empty. After a while, I went back. The screens were still on, the feeds unchanged, but something felt different now. I sat down slowly, my eyes going straight to the hallway camera. I rewound the footage, just a few minutes, back to the moment I had seen the movement. At first, it looked the same. Then, I noticed it. Something was there in the frame that I had seen before, not just at the edge, not partially hidden, but further in, just enough to be visible if you were looking closely. It wasn't clear, not defined, but it was there in a way it hadn't been when I was watching it live. Primero stared at it, trying to understand how I could have missed something like that. And the more I watched it, the more it felt like I hadn't missed it at all. It just hadn't been there yet. The clip that was deleted, I didn't sleep after that. I stayed in front of the screens until the sky started to lighten. The feed slowly shifting from darkness into that flat, colorless gray of early morning. Nothing else happened. No movement, no glitches, no strange angles appearing where they shouldn't. Just the same quiet house, unchanged, like the night before hadn't meant anything at all. At some points, I convinced myself I needed to check the recording again, not just replay it, but really look at it, frame by frame if I had to. I wanted to understand what I had seen, to confirm it in a way that didn't leave room for doubt, because the longer I sat there, the less certain I felt about it. So I went back into the system and pulled up the footage from the night before. Or at least, I tried to. The timestamp was still there. I remembered it clearly, down to the exact minute I had rewound to. But when I opened that section of the recording, there was nothing unusual. The hallway looked exactly the way it always did. Empty, still. No movement at the edge of the frame. No shape further in. Just nothing. I frowned and scrolled back a little further, then forward again, thinking maybe I had the wrong time. It wouldn't have been the first time I'd misread something, but the more I searched, the more it became clear. The clip wasn't there. Not missing in the sense that it was corrupted or broken. There were no gaps in the timeline. No errors in the system. Everything flowed smoothly from one moment to the next, like the recording had never been interrupted at all. It was just gone. I checked the backups next, going through every saved file from that night. Nothing. Then the system logs, looking for any sign that something had been deleted or altered. There were no records of anything unusual, no indication that anything had changed. It was as if that moment had never been recorded in the first place. I sat back slowly, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the less certain I felt. I knew I had seen something. I remembered getting up, walking down the hallway, checking the rooms. That part was real. But the footage, the image on the screen, the shape that hadn't been there before, I wasn't as sure anymore. The thought crept in quietly, settling somewhere in the back of my mind. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd been staring at the screens for too long, looking for something that wasn't there, until my mind started filling in the gaps. I wanted to believe that, but there was still something that didn't sit right, something I couldn't quite explain. Because even if the clip was gone, I could still remember the exact moment I realized it had changed, and I didn't know which part of that was worse. The realization, I stopped looking for a single explanation after that. Up until then, I'd been trying to isolate each thing on its own. The door, the lights, the frame that froze, the clip that didn't belong. I kept telling myself there had to be a separate reason for each of them. Something small and reasonable that I just hadn't figured out yet. But sitting there, staring at a timeline that had quietly erased something I knew I had seen, that way of thinking didn't hold together anymore. It wasn't one thing. It was all of it. The angle from that unknown camera, the one I never installed. The way it showed a part of the house I had left uncovered, like it had chosen the one place I wouldn't TV watching. The movement at the edge of the frame, always just outside of view, never stepping far enough in to be clearly seen. And then the way the footage itself shifted, like it could decide what stayed and what disappeared. I started going back through everything, not just the recent clips, but older ones too. I wasn't looking for obvious changes anymore. I was looking for patterns, times where the cameras hesitated, even slightly, moments where something could have happened in the space between frames. They were there, not constant, not obvious, but consistent enough that I couldn't ignore them. Small interruptions, barely noticeable, unless you were searching for them. A second missing here, a flicker there. The kind of thing I would have dismissed before without a second thought. Now they felt deliberate. I leaned back in my chair, trying to put it into words in a way that made sense, but every version of it sounded wrong. Too extreme, too unlikely. But the alternative didn't feel any better. Something had been inside the house. Not in a way I could see directly, Not in a way that showed up clearly on the recordings, but present enough to leave traces. Moving in the spaces I wasn't watching, staying just out of frame, just outside my awareness. And somehow, it wasn't just avoiding the cameras, it was interacting with them. That was the part that stayed with me. The missing clip, the angle that shouldn't exist, the way certain moments seemed to vanish while everything else stayed intact. It didn't feel random, it felt controlled. Like whatever was there understood exactly how the system worked. Understood what I would see, and what I wouldn't. I looked back at the screens again, at the empty hallway. The still frames that now felt less like reassurance and more like something staged. Something presented to me in a way I was meant to accept without question. That was when the thought settled in, heavier than anything else before it. Maybe I hadn't been reviewing the footage at all. Maybe I had only been seeing what something wanted me to see. And if that was true, then whatever had been moving through the house hadn't just been hiding from me. It had been watching me too. The final clip, I almost didn't find it. If I hadn't kept digging, going deeper into the system than I ever had before, I probably would have missed it completely. It wasn't in the usual folders. Not anywhere I'd expect something recent to be stored. It was buried under older files, mislabeled in a way that made it blend in, like it was meant to be overlooked. At first, I thought it was just another empty recording. The timestamp didn't mean anything to me. The preview looked dark, indistinct, nothing that stood out from the dozens of other clips I'd already gone through. But something about it held my attention just long enough for me to open it. The angle was the same. Low, hidden. That part of the house I never covered. For a moment, nothing moved. The frame sat there, quiet and still. The same dim lighting stretching across the floor and into the edge of the wall. I felt that familiar tension settle in, the kind that had been building over the past few nights. But this time it felt sharper, more focused. Then I saw it. It was already there. Standing further back in the frame, partially swallowed by the darkness, but not enough to miss. A figure, completely still, facing directly toward the camera. Not turned away, not angled slightly, like before. Facing it. As if it knew exactly where the lens was. I leaned closer without realizing it, my eyes fixed on the screen. There was no movement at first. No shift, no sign of breathing, nothing to suggest it was even real. Just a shape with the outline of a person, standing in a place that should have been empty. I didn't recognize it. That thought came immediately, clear and certain. It wasn't someone I knew, wasn't anyone who should have been there. And yet, the way it stood, the way it held itself in that space, felt familiar in a way I couldn't explain. Tenit mobed slowly. Not sudden, not aggressive, just a gradual step forward, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. The kind of movement that didn't draw attention to itself, but made everything else feel wrong. Another step. It didn't look around. It didn't hesitate. It just kept moving toward the camera, steady and deliberate, like it had all the time in the world. Like it knew exactly what it was doing. I realized then that I wasn't just watching it. It felt like it was waiting for me to watch it. The distance between it and the lens closed slowly, each step bringing more detail into view, but never enough to fully make it out. The darkness held on to it, keeping it just unclear enough that I couldn't focus on any one feature. And then, just as it got close enough that I thought I might finally see something clearly, the clip ended. No fade, no cut, just a sudden stop. I sat there in silence, staring at the frozen frame where it had disappeared, my reflection faintly visible in the screen. Closing reflection, it was already inside. I never found anything beyond the footage. No signs of forced entry, no misplaced objects that couldn't be explained away, nothing physical I could point to and say, this proves it happened. The house stayed the same. Quiet, still, exactly the way it had always been, but that didn't mean it felt the same. For a while, I kept checking the system, going back through recordings like I had before, hoping something would reappear, something clear enough to confirm what I'd already started to believe. But after that last clip, there was nothing else. No strange angles, no missing segments, no movements at the edge of the frame, just normal footage. Eventually, I stopped looking, not because I felt better, but because I didn't know what I was supposed to be looking for anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever I had seen had never really been clear to begin with. It was always just out of reach, just beyond what I could fully understand. And that's the part that stayed with me. It wasn't the figure itself, or the way it moved, or even the fact that it had been there at all. It was the idea that something could exist in the same space as me without ever being fully seen, that it could move through the house, through those familiar rooms, without leaving anything behind, except fragments. Glimpses, moments. that could be dismissed if you didn't look closely enough. Or if you looked too closely. I started thinking about all the times I hadn't checked the footage, all the nights I had gone to sleep without reviewing anything, assuming everything was fine. How many moments had passed that I never questioned? How many small details had I ignored because they didn't seem important at the time? It's easy to believe you'd notice something like that, something out of place, something wrong. But now, I'm not so sure. The cameras were supposed to make things clearer. That was the whole reason I installed them, to give me something reliable, something I could trust more than my own memory. And for a while, they did exactly that. Until they didn't. Now, when I think back to that first clip, the one I wasn't supposed to see, I don't focus on the figure anymore. I don't try to picture its face, or understand what it was doing there. I think about how long it might have been there before I ever noticed it. Because, the truth is, I don't know when any of it started, and I don't know when it stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch myself listening for things I can't quite hear, paying attention to the kind of silence that feels too complete. Not because I expect to see something again, but because I can't shake the feeling that it never really needed to be seen in the first place. Maybe the camera didn't capture something it wasn't supposed to. Maybe it captured exactly what it was meant to, and I was the one who wasn't supposed to see it.